Welcome everybody to the last day of the Integrate conference. So today we kick off with Microsoft MVP Dan Toomey, who's all the way from Queensland in Australia. So in his session, Dan shows you the BizTalk Migrator. So this tool helps you when migrating your BizTalk solutions to Azure Serverless technologies. So quickly over to Dan.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction, Surya. So welcome everybody to the third day of Integrate 2021. This is my fifth year in a row speaking at the conference, but I think it's probably my eighth or ninth year in a row, I've kind of lost count, of actually attending this conference. And we all know that it's the best Microsoft integration conference of the year. So I feel very, very privileged to be invited to speak at it, and I want to thank Kobai for giving me this great opportunity. So as Surya already said to you, the topic I'm going to talk about today is how you can take your integration platform, your server-based integration platform, which of course is BizTalk Server, and lift that to a modern cloud architecture with specifically with the help of the BizTalk Migrator tool. So I'd like to express my thanks to two people who have kind of helped and contribute to this presentation. One is Beck Lyons, who you've already heard speak a few times now at this conference. Beck's on the Microsoft Group team, and she's not only contributed to this product, I'm sure, but she also reviewed my slides for me to make sure that I'm not telling you any fibs. So thanks very much, Beck, for that. And also Daniel Probert, who is a huge contributor to this product, but also has done a number of presentations himself about the BizTalk Migrator at like Global Integration Bootcamp and Integration Down Under. And I've actually stolen a couple of his slides with his permission. So thank you, Daniel, for your help on this as well. I guess when we're talking about migrating from BizTalk, so you might want to ask the question about why you would want to do that in the first place. Well, you know, after all, BizTalk is a very, very powerful product, and a lot of corporations have invested in it. I keep hearing a stat of about 80 to 90% of the Fortune 500 companies use BizTalk. It's obviously a huge investment, and the product is very powerful. So why would you want to move from that? Well, there can be a number of reasons for that. One is the problem with any product that is server-based is that it relies on servers. It's a big surprise there. So there's obviously costs associated with both maintaining the physical infrastructure for that, like the hardware and all, and also the licensing costs. But there's another issue as well, and it's that because it relies not only on the physical hardware, but on the software as well, like namely the operating system. And BizTalk being a very complicated product, we know that it relies on Windows Server, SQL Server, and Visual Studio. And the problem is that anytime any one of those products upgrades to the new version, you now have a compatibility issue. Now, BizTalk has had an amazing release cadence. You know, since it first came out in 2000, there's been a new release every 2 years, at least, sometimes even more frequently than that. And the product is continually built, and they keep adding new features to it. But one of the principal drivers for having those new releases, I think, has always been platform alignment, because they need to keep up with the new versions of Windows Server or SQL or Visual Studio. So I just kind of term that as version bondage. And, you know, they can get expensive after a while if you have to keep upgrading all the time. The other aspect, of course, is that you know, every server-based product is eventually going to go out of support, and you're going to want to have to upgrade to that. And that becomes an expensive prospect, especially if you don't do it frequently. If you wait, you know, for 5 releases before you do an upgrade, then it's a huge process. I think Sandro would have taken you through the other day, you know, some of the issues if you're jumping from like BizTalk 2010 to BizTalk 2020. And of course, skills shortage is another issue as well. You know, good BizTalk developers, you know, are kind of a rare breed. It's the reason that I've been able to make a living and get paid well. But, you know, a lot of companies don't want to be held hostage by those skills and the people who have them. I think probably the main reason, and probably the best driver, though, for moving away from BizTalk Server is to take advantage of all the fantastic opportunities that you have in the cloud with a modern cloud architecture. You know, your scalability, your agility, the reliability and redundancy, low maintenance, all the things that you would have heard many people at this conference, including Beck Lyons, talk about, you know, about the reasons for the incentives for modernizing your architecture. So that's really a big driver in this. Now, before I leave this slide, I think I really need to talk about that T-Rex. You would have seen this logo come out fairly recently, well, a few years ago with BizTalk 2016, and the tagline, "The T-Rex is loose." Well, actually, that goes, here's a bit of trivia for you, but that goes all the way back to the beginning of BizTalk. When BizTalk was first released in the year 2000, Zona Research published an article praising BizTalk and its capabilities, and it ended the article by saying the T-Rex is loose. So that didn't actually come from Microsoft, although of course Microsoft was quick to pick it up and use it because it was kind of a cool line. And then it was resurrected more recently in some of the more recent editions of BizTalk. I'll leave it to you to determine whether there's any subliminal messages in there with associating an extinct dinosaur with BizTalk Server. Anyway, with that, I'll move on. So now we understand some motivations for why we would want to migrate. The next question, of course, that's going to be asking is, BizTalk's a powerful product. Can the cloud actually do everything that BizTalk can do? Can I accomplish the same things? So the first thing you have to be aware of is that you're not comparing apples and apples, right? A cloud-based architecture is inherently going to be much different than a server-based architecture. And what you really need to do is kind of rebuild your solution. So instead of worrying about whether your apple looks like an orange, you should probably just be worried about whether you get your vitamin C. Translated into technology terms, it means that you shouldn't necessarily worry whether every single component of BizTalk has an exact mirror in Azure. What you need to worry about is, can you solve the integration problem that you're using BizTalk to solve using cloud technology? And the answer to that is yes. And even if we actually break it down and look at some of the main features about BizTalk, you'll see there's actually pretty good parity among those things. So BizTalk, as we know, it's a messaging engine. It's a very robust messaging engine, a public subscribed system. Well, we certainly have that with Azure Service Bus. And I would argue that Azure Service Bus is in some ways even more powerful than BizTalk's. It has features that BizTalk doesn't have. For example, like deduplication. I wonder if you knew that Service Bus could do that to make sure you don't get the same messages twice. And of course, a Service Bus is infinitely scalable too, which is unlike your BizTalk server. You're never going to have to worry about throttling when you're using Azure Service Bus. Another big selling point for BizTalk Server, of course, is the out-of-the-box adapters that you get, which enables you to connect to your systems without having to write heaps of code to do that. So last I counted, I think it's about 25 adapters that come out of the box with BizTalk, including the enterprise adapters. And of course, there's third-party adapters that you can buy as well. But Logic Apps gives you, at the moment, more than 450 connectors. So I think they've got that pretty well covered. And not only that, but you can also drive your Logic Apps or your solutions with event-based triggers as well, from using Azure Functions or Event Grid, which is not as easy to do with BizTalk Server, unless maybe you use Sandro's scheduled task adapter. That's one example that works pretty well. Orchestration, well, we definitely have that covered with Logic Apps. They both do workflows quite well. And if you're determined to write code instead of using a low-code solution, you can always use Azure Durable Functions as well, because they're stateful workflows. Now, schemas and maps is probably one of the best examples of where you actually have lift and shift. None of this other stuff is lift and shift, but the schemas and maps, you can take those directly from BizTalk, and by deploying them into an integration account, you can use them exactly as is and call them from your Logic Apps. So that works pretty well. And of course, we also have liquid template support. Pipelines are really just an assembly line of components that run and do some processing on your messages. You can easily build that using actions in Logic Apps or calls out to architecture functions. Now, when you get to the business rules engine, here you start to get to a situation where you don't really have out-of-the-box capabilities in Azure that kind of that directly relate to that. So what I've found is that most of the clients where we've used Business Rules Engine have actually used it more for configuration than anything else. And it works really well for that, for your non-secure configuration. You'd use SSO for your sensitive stuff. If you're just doing that, well, you've got Azure App Configuration to handle that, and Key Vault. But if you actually are using the powerful forward chaining capabilities of the business rules, then really, if you want to do that in the cloud, you're probably going to have to rely on a third-party product. The Selective In rule comes to mind as one product that can do that well. There are others too. You can also potentially look at lifting the BRE into Azure, and there's a blog post or an article on TechNet, I think. I'll put a link to it at the end of my slides, where somebody talks about how to do that, because it's effectively .NET libraries after all. So there are ways to get around that. The other one is BAM. And BAM, I've always felt, is one of the most underutilized features of BizTalk, even though it's one of the most powerful features. And sad to say, even on all the projects that I've been on, most of the time, BAM is used for instrumentation, rather than actually using it what it's intended to be, which is business activity monitoring, and actually being able to give you insights into the actual business processes that your executives want to see and how things are working. And it's often used as applied as an afterthought. Well, if your BAM solution is primarily instrumentation, we've got lots of that covered in Azure between Azure Monitor and Azure Application Insights and Log Analytics. I mean, there's all kinds of instrumentation available. You would have seen some demos from that, in fact, already in this conference. But if you're actually using BAM the way it's meant to be used, again, you would either have to build that from scratch yourself in Azure, or you could rely on a third-party product. And there happens to be one really good one that I know of called Atomic Scope. So Atomic Scope is really well suited to being able to track the processes in your BizTalk and your cloud applications. It can work across both, but certainly works just in cloud as well, for being able to track your application business processes. Now, for the life of me, for some reason, I can't think of who it is that makes Atomic Scope. The company's on the tip of my tongue somewhere, but I just can't think of it anywhere. I'm sure somebody at this conference, though, will be able to tell you who it is that makes that great. So one thing to take away from all of this is that this is not lift and shift, right? If you want a lift and shift answer to your BizTalk, well, you just deploy BizTalk servers in the cloud and use an AWS solution. But that's not going to get you the benefit of a modern serverless cloud architecture. So you really are talking about re-architecting and rebuilding your integration platform. And that's kind of a scary thought. It's daunting. It's a lot of work to do that. So that's where the BizTalk Migrator tool comes to help. So this is a tool that's designed specifically for you to be able to transfer your BizTalk applications into Azure Integration Services, do that translation for you, or a lot of it anyway. Now, it's not like a magic button where you push that and boom, everything just immediately translates and deploys and works perfectly. It's going to give you what I would call a jump start on that, and a very big jump start on that. So it will definitely accelerate the process. But you're still going to have to do a fair amount of work to fine tune it and get it to work, unless you have a very, very simple BizTalk solution. So what it is a command line utility. You point it at your BizTalk MSI file, and it will go through and parse that file, discover all the artifacts in it, analyze them, identify the integration patterns, and then produce a nice HTML report that tells you what it found and what it thinks it can do to reproduce that capability in Azure for you. And then if you choose to go to the convert step or the migrate step, it will actually generate all of the deployment artifacts that you need to actually deploy it into Azure, including your ARM templates, your PowerShell scripts, your JSON files, and schemas and maps, and everything that you need to do that, which is really quite handy. The tool is built with a pluggable architecture in it, and it's open source. And that was a very deliberate act on Microsoft to invite the community to contribute to this project. So Microsoft has given us a really good start on the product. It still has somewhat limited capability, but they want the community to contribute and help expand that. So right now, it's still in preview, by the way. What is supported are these three adapters, the file, FTP, and HTTP adapters. You have all four of the built-in pipelines are supported, and in many of the pipeline components, the ones we use most often. With the disassembler and assembler, there is only the most common features that are actually supported, not everything. For example, I don't think it does envelope handling yet. Most of your orchestration shapes are in there. Some of the ones that wouldn't be would be obviously called rules, suspend or compensate within there, but pretty much anything in an orchestration that you can picture being done in a logic app will translate fine, including maps. Maps both in the orchestration and in the ports, they'll be carried through. It's property promotion and demotion, so you can do your content-based routing. And if it comes across something in your orchestration that it can handle, and an example of that might be an expression shape with some inline C#, it will, if it can't, it's not going to migrate that, but what it will do is put a placeholder so that you know that you've got to add something in there manually. Probably one of the most useful things that this does, though, is it creates for you the whole foundation for your integration platform in Azure and a whole lot of the common services. So if you think about BizTalk, whenever you install BizTalk, you always get this default BizTalk.system application. And that application includes all the foundational components like your property schemas, your built-in pipelines, and your adapters. That's exactly what this tool does, only of course it implements that using Azure-based artifacts. So that alone is extremely helpful. Even if you don't deploy or migrate a specific application, just by doing that alone, you now have a foundation for you to build integration services in the cloud. So what's not supported at the moment is, of course, any adapter that wasn't one of those three on the last slide. So a notable omission would be the WCF adapters. This doesn't mean, by the way, with any of this stuff that you can't do it in Azure. It just means the tool hasn't yet been written to automatically convert that stuff for you. And the reason is obviously, what the team has concentrated on is what's used 80% of the time to get the most use out of it. And it can be expanded and is hopefully will be expanded by both Microsoft and the community to include some of this stuff later on. I've already mentioned envelope handling is not handled, so therefore necessarily recoverable interchange handling wouldn't be there. Inline C# wouldn't be carried across exactly, but I think placeholders will be generated for that. And by complex orchestrations, just think about anything you can't imagine implementing in a logic app right now. That would be an example. Some things I could think of is like how you would write compensation blocks for exception management. And I'm going to talk about exception management a little bit later because it works quite differently in logic apps than it does in BizTalk. But other than that, most of this, as I said, about 80% of what people use BizTalk for will actually carry over pretty well with this migrator tool. So what do you need to use the tool? Well, first off, Windows. It doesn't run on Linux yet. And if the only way to install the tool right now is through Chocolatey. If you haven't used Chocolatey yet, it's nothing to worry about. It's actually very simple to use. And it's very, very simple. I'll show you the next screen, like how it does the install. Once you've installed it and you're actually going to use it to migrate applications, well, since you're planning on deploying something to Azure, you obviously need an Azure subscription. You'll want the Azure CLI and the latest version of PowerShell. I'd say version 7 or use PowerShell Core. I did try using PowerShell 5.4.1, I think, the first time, and I ran into a couple of snags in there. So just go for the latest one. Installing the tool is really easy once you have Chocolatey installed. It's just one simple command here, choco install BizTalk Migrator. And right now, because it is still in preview, you need to use the preview flag on that. But it takes literally seconds, and it's one screen of output. And right at the end there, you've got your full installation of the tool, and it's all ready to go. When it comes time to actually converting an application, at the moment, it only supports parsing MSI files. In the future, there may be plans to try to point it at a BizTalk group or maybe even a Visual Studio solution. But at the moment, it needs the MSI files. And you can give it one file or you can give it several files if you want. And I think you can even point it at a folder with a bunch of MSI files, and it will do them all at once. There are basically 4 commands or 4 types of commands that you can run with this tool. The verify is currently not implemented. What that would be is it would not only run the tool and do the conversion, but it would automatically deploy the solution to Azure and then run tests on it. That's planned for the future, but it's not yet implemented. What you can do right now is run it in assess mode, which basically goes as far as doing the analysis and generating the report, and that's it. And then if you choose the migrate or convert option, it will actually create all of the artifacts, the deployment artifacts, the ARM templates and everything that you need to deploy it to Azure. And there's lots of optional parameters that you can feed into this command to control how it works. This is like heaps, actually. I'm only giving you a few here. One of them is in case you want to point it at an ISE instead of the normal consumption-based environment, there's a flag for that. You can feed it a subscription ID if you don't want to use the default subscription that your login is currently set to. You can choose to identify a primary and a secondary region. If you don't specify the region, I think it defaults to West Central US. But the cool thing is that if you just give it the primary, it will automatically choose a secondary that is paired with the primary that you chose, which is kind of a nice feature. And you can also give it a unique deployment ID. If you don't give it one, the tool will generate a random one for you, a random number, about 4 or 5 digits. And what it does with that is it appends that ID to every artifact that it creates in Azure. So that enables you to have some isolation. You don't have any clashes. So here's an example of the tool as I've run it. So you can see that that I've run using the migrate option. I don't know if you can see. Yeah, hopefully you can see it. Maybe I'll just zoom in a little bit. So I've run the tool with the migrate option, and you fed it an MSI file, and there's a little bit of a syntax with that. Rather than just giving the file name itself, you actually have to use this expression. It says Microsoft.BizTalk.ms discover.ms files equals, and then you give it the MSI. You can see I chose to identify a primary region of Australia East, because that's where I live. And I chose to give it a unique deployment ID, which I just said was 1129. Now, what's cool here is that you see I chose the non-default primary region. So it then worked out from there that the secondary region should be Australia Southeast, and it figured that out itself. So that generated a few pages of output, but it only took 8 seconds, if you look at the timestamps, to actually fully analyze and output all of the deployment artifacts for this in Azure, which was about 353 resource files. And what does that output looks like? Basically, in your file system, wherever you've run the tool from, it will create a folder for you with an AIM dash and then whatever that deployment ID is that it generated. At the root level of that folder, you'll have your BizTalk migration report, which is the HTML report. The rest of these files here are just subpages that are linked from the main page. We'll have a look at what that report looks like in a moment. And you'll get an unpacked folder, which basically has all of the artifacts that are extracted out of your MSI file in there. And that's just for the tool to be able to use when it's generating scripts. If you use the convert or migrate option on the tool, then you will get a conversion folder. And under that folder, you'll have your folder for the message bus artifacts that need to be deployed, some other generated components, scripts and snippets and stuff, and then a folder for your application, as well as the BizTalk, the system application. And that will contain all of the scripts and ARM templates and everything that's needed to deploy to Azure, which means that you can then go in and edit those things if there's stuff that you want to change before you actually deploy it. So just recapping what the tool actually does when you run it. Initially, it does a discover by looking at your BizTalk MSI file. As I said, the BizTalk group and the Visual Studio BizTalk solution aren't supported yet, but they hopefully will be in the future. It then parses out those objects into the orchestrations, pipelines, your schemas and maps and your other artifacts, analyzes them to see if it can identify any orchestration or integration patterns in there. There's no support yet for test cases. Again, that might be a future addition. And then it will generate a report for you. Now, if you haven't done the migrate or convert option, that's where it will stop. But if you have decided to do conversion, it will then generate the artifacts to deploy all of that. And the verify, as I mentioned, isn't yet implemented. Now, to understand what this produces, it's helpful to understand the integration pattern called routing slip. This is a well-known enterprise integration pattern. If you go to the enterpriseintegrationpatterns.com website by Gregory Hopp, you'll see it written up as one of the patterns that's there. And essentially what it is it generates an itinerary dynamically based on a message. It will determine what components that message needs to travel through in its integration path, and then generates what a routing slip which goes along with that message and basically is used to route it to all the components that it needs to go to. And this is the pattern that the tool will implement when it translates the solution to Azure. It's also helpful to understand the messaging object model. So every BizTalk application is basically broken down into a model that's comprised of various integration patterns. And the model really only has 4 types of components in it. So you have endpoints, which is your entry and your exit part of the solution. It has intermediaries, which are the actual processing blocks. So that could be either a map or an orchestration or a pipeline component. The channels are the links between each of those intermediaries. And of course, the messages themselves are the data that's passed between those components. And if you think about it, any integration solution can be broken down into those 4 components. So if we look at what a BizTalk application might look like when it's translated into Azure Integration Services. So let's say that you had a very simple BizTalk application that accepted an FTP file as a flat file. It performed some logic on that, including a map, saved it to the message box, and then had a subscriber that picked it up and sent it out as HTTP. And there would be some, validation and some property promotion that would be involved in that. So all the components in your receive port can be basically implemented in logic apps. And with the help of an integration account for your schemas and your maps, and the itinerary and the routing slip is managed through a function which makes use of Azure App Configuration. And actually, this is fronted by an API management instance. The message box in Azure Integration Services is actually Service Bus. And if your message is too big for Service Bus, we would then use the claim check pattern where we'll simply store the message into blob storage temporarily and have a ticket for it that's actually put on the queue for the topic. And then that gets picked up in your send port. Again, all of the components in the send port that you would normally find, like your maps and your assemblers and your property promotion or demotion can happen again through the logic apps. So since Logic Apps makes a very large part of the solution, it's helpful to understand kind of the pattern that they've used to create these. And most of them will follow this pattern and look like this. It's a checkpoint pattern. So you'll start with a trigger, of course. You'll have a bunch of variables that get initialized. But then every set of actions that happens is put inside of a decision shape. And there's a checkpoint on each one of these so that it can actually determine whether or not that set of actions is appropriate for the message as it's going through. It helps kind of to implement the routing slip pattern, but it also makes it very, very easy to track the processing that's happening for any given message. So, for example, if we were to take a normal logic app that I would develop myself, we'd start with a trigger. I'd perform an action or two, and then probably a connector out to some service, whether it be SQL or maybe Salesforce or something like that. I would determine whether it's successful or not, and go on to the next action or next step that I want to do, which is maybe call out to a function and do some processing or something. And then if that's successful, continue on with an action there, which may be, for example, completing a message on a queue if that's what I got it. So that's all well and good. We look at this and we can see that each one of these are individual steps. But what if step one fails? Then I've got to figure out how to escape doing the rest of this stuff. Or also, if I suppose I have to restart or resume something, getting it to start at the right place and not repeat actions that I don't need to would be a little bit tricky. So what they've done, the way they're structured the logic apps here, is that, as I mentioned, all the sets of steps, all the components that make up a step anyway, are put inside a single decision shape that starts with a checkpoint. So you find out, are you in the right place to execute these actions? And if you are, then you complete the actions. If they're successful, you then set the checkpoint for the next step to then evaluate to see if it's suitable to execute those steps. And then that continues. And the good thing about this is that you can, when you look at this and you look at the execution of the logic app, everything is right at the top level. So you can tell exactly how the message flowed through all those different steps. And you also have the ability to have a fall through. So that if this step fails and it doesn't set the right checkpoint, it's just going to fall through everything until you get to the catch-all at the bottom, which can then manage the exceptions. So that kind of translates into what we saw earlier with those decision shapes. Now, the tool, they've not only given you the tool in Microsoft, but they've actually given you 4 sample scenarios, which includes actually the BizTalk MSI files that you can download, and then you can practice using the tool on it to see how it will work. And maybe if any of these scenarios are very, very similar to your BizTalk application, you can actually use them as a starting point. So for the demo that I'm about to show you, I chose scenario number 4 because to me that seemed like it had the most in it. So basically, it's just receiving. It's a simple orchestration with a map in it that has a request response port in it, and it receives a JSON request, translates it to XML, obviously, and processes it, and then executes the map and sends the response back out, which it then translates back into JSON. Now, if we look at how what the architecture for this would be in BizTalk, as the BizTalk application, well, we start, of course, with the platform, the BizTalk platform, which has a messaging engine that's implemented in SQL Server. We then have the BizTalk system application, which is the BizTalk components that's on the server. And that, as we mentioned before, includes things like your property schemas and your pipelines and all of that. So that makes up your platform. Then you have the application that we just discussed that gets deployed over that. And in this case, as I said, it's very simple. It's just an orchestration with a map and a two-way receive port, which then, of course, has a receive and a send pipeline. And all of this is deployed with a binding file that ties it all together. Now, if we want to implement this in Azure, what the migrator will do is, again, you have your platform, which is made up of the message bus. And in this case, the message bus actually includes all of those platform level components that we need in Azure. So things like your API management instance, a bunch of functions and logic apps, your integration account, and default and app insights, and all those other things that you need to have the basic framework. There's also a BizTalk system application, which adds on top of that a bunch of logic apps, a couple of API connectors, and a service bus namespace. So that, again, is your platform. And that gets deployed with any application that you do. Now, the specific application that we deploy in this case is going to be broken down into 3 logic apps: purchase order receive, process, and then a request response port to manage that. And just 2 API connectors to service bus. And that's it. That's the application part of it all. And this is deployed into 3 separate resource groups. So these bottom 2 resource groups you always get with the application. That's the foundational stuff. And then you have the application itself in its own resource group. So with that, let's have a look at the real thing. Okay, so what I've done is I've run the tool pointing at my MSI file, and that produced this output. There's the AIM folder with the unique deployment ID that I gave it. And if we open that up, we can have what I showed you in the slide before. You had the unpack, which has all the BizTalk MSI components, and then under the conversion, we have our applications. The system application is there, and then the actual specific my custom application with all of its materials in there. And if we go back to here, I think you have a script that says basically deploy all. When I want to deploy it to Azure, I just have to run that PowerShell script, and that will deploy the whole solution for me. Now it also output this BizTalk migration report, which looks like this. The report gives you some basic run information, including the command line arguments. Now, I only provided a few, but it also lists all of the default values that would have been provided that I didn't specify. It then shows you the analysis of the BizTalk MSI file and shows all of the BizTalk artifacts that it found in that file. And you can actually drill down and get more, the properties, and including the related components in that for each of these. It then gives you the message bus. Now this is produced the same in every output file, obviously, because this is the built-in framework stuff, but you can see how it's implemented in it. The only thing that would change in the file is the unique identifier that I've given it that gets appended to every resource. And then you have your applications that are output, and there could be many applications if you gave it several MSI files. There's always the system application, which looks the same all the time. But then there's your custom application. And opening this, you can see that it's taken this solution and broke it down into, its messages, endpoints, channels, and intermediaries. There's 3 scenarios. The first scenario is the receive of the file. So these are all the components that have to do with that. You can see how we're using a routing slip. And this will tell you what components it's actually deploying. And then the second scenario is the response. So this is all in returning the result. And then there's the processor down here. And you can actually look at each one of these artifacts and get the details from it, including what BizTalk properties it actually was working with, and then what components it's actually creating, like the logic app, for example, and even list the deployment scripts, the specific names, which is actually very helpful if you want to actually change anything in there. You can find them quite easily. So that's the report. If we want to just look at the solution itself, so this is the original BizTalk application, a very simple orchestration with a request response port and a map in it. There's the map. And a send and receive pipeline that basically has a validator and a disassembler and JSON decoder and JSON encoder. So on the way out. What does that look like in Azure? It looks like, oops, sorry, this one. In Azure, we have our 3 resource groups that were deployed, the message bus being one of them. And you can see that's where you have all your foundational components that are supporting the platform, including your API management, your app configuration, app insights, integration account, all that stuff. You have the system application, which is just really just a bunch of logic apps, a service bus namespace, and some connectors. And you can see what the logic apps are, but by how they're named, you can tell what they're doing. It's very basic functions that you would expect BizTalk to be doing: JSON encoder and decoder, constructor, envelope wrapper, those kind of things. And then here's my actual custom application. And all of that broke down to just 3 logic apps and 2 API connections. And that was all that's needed. If I want to see how the logic app itself looks, I can go into here and look at the designer, and we'll see that pattern, which I showed you before in the slide. You've got the trigger, you've got a whole bunch of initialization, and then you've got all these steps, which are in their own decide shapes, and they're all preceded with a checkpoint to make sure you're in the right place. So this one, because it's the first one, there's no checkpoint value set yet, but the second one will make sure that the checkpoint get configuration has been set, which meant that last step completed. Okay, and just to prove that all of this works, this is, I'm using Postman to call my local BizTalk instance. You can see that it's pointing at that where I have it deployed. It just gives it a simple purchase order and it comes back with a response. This is the actual logic app endpoint for what was deployed into Azure. I'm not going to execute that again because it will take about a minute with the cold start, but you can see that the response that I executed early comes back exactly the same, almost exactly the same. There is one slight difference. You'll notice the order quantity is a number in this case with the BizTalk application. With Azure, it came back as a string. I'm going to talk about that in a second when we go back to the slides. But that's an example of a real-life solution. So differences from BizTalk. So first, there's an issue with using the flat file encoder that there are some compatible issues around suppression of empty nodes. This has nothing to do with the BizTalk Migrator. It just has to do with running that thing from the integration account. But the JSON encode and decode, although it's Newtonsoft's.NET library, they're slightly different. The Azure version is slightly different from the one from BizTalk. And as a result, you might get slightly different output emitted. And that's why I just showed you that example where the number was turned into a string. So you might have to watch for that. It's also handy to note that in BizTalk, if you send it a message that it doesn't recognize or that there's no subscribers for, BizTalk will immediately reject the message and throw an error. That's not how Azure Service Bus works. If you publish a message to Azure Service Bus, but there's no subscribers, it will just sit there in Service Bus until the message expires, and then it'll eventually move to a dead letter queue. So you need to be aware of that handling is a little bit different. That's important for you. And the same thing then with unknown schemas. An unknown schema, BizTalk will reject it, but Service Bus, it's just a message with no subscribers, so it's going to sit there. Also, exception handling works differently in BizTalk than it does in Logic Apps. In Logic Apps, you have the run after functionality. So because of that, the migrator tool will not immediately translate your exception blocks, and definitely not your compensation blocks, into that. You'll have to re-implement that manually. Now, there are a list of some other problems, things to watch out for. I won't go through all of them now because I'm running out of time. But one thing to be aware of is when the tool will automatically deploy the cheapest resources that it can, including a free integration account and a free app configuration service. The problem is that you're only allowed one of those in each subscription. So if you've already got one deployed, your deployment will fail. So the way around that is you get around and modify the deployment scripts to either use the existing ones or you use a different SKU on those. What's coming? More adapters. So these are ones that are prioritized at the moment. The SFFT, the SAP, and the WCF Basic and Web HTTP. They're also pushing for Logic App standard support. Just be aware that that isn't necessarily going to run locally when they do that, because Logic App standard, the converted BizTalk app relies on Service Bus and App Config, and those aren't yet available locally. And another big thing that they need to work on is the performance enhancements, because right now there is a bit of latency involved, and that has to do with the polling intervals and stuff, which is again a balance of cost versus performance. What can you do? Definitely do this survey, because this is how the team is going to prioritize the features that they start adding in it. So definitely take that survey, and if you're a developer sort and want to get your hands dirty, start contributing to the project. They would be happy to accept pull requests for new features. I've given you a bunch of references and just the key takeaways. Remember that this is not a lift and shift scenario. You're re-architecting to the cloud, but this tool will give you an enormous accelerator to doing that process by jumpstarting it with a framework and the building blocks, and being able to translate quite a bit of the standard things you do in BizTalk. And it's community driven, so we really want you to get involved and help them build this product so that we can start moving applications to the modern cloud architecture. And with that, I think I'm about 2 minutes over time. Maybe. So I don't know if there's time for questions or not, but yeah, thank you very much for listening and attending, and do reach out to me if you have any questions. I'll be happy to answer those questions.
And you can answer the questions. Probably that will be recorded, and when people watch the recording, they will be able to get the answers.
Okay, fantastic. Well, I'll do that now. I'll go into moderate and see what we have. Let me see. Right. Ronnie, Dan Probert. That's actually, that's Dan. Okay. You don't need, okay, wait a minute. I see this. All the questions are starting to appear now. Can you use liquid templates to do complex translation, which custom XSLT provides? So yes, I haven't done a lot of work with liquid templates myself, but yes, you can use them. I do believe they're used for translation. I believe it works. It definitely works with JSON. I'm sure it works with XML as well. So I would say yes to that one. Liquid is to JSON what? Oh, there we go. So liquid. Thank you, Manish. Liquid is to JSON what XSLT is to XML. What is my opinion on the principle of migrating? It would, for instance, also migrate historic bad decision and orchestration quirks. Yes, that's true, Jasper, it would. So, because you actually are re-architecting, it is an opportunity for you to look at the processes that you're doing and review that and make sure, because, there's always, as long as you're going to rebuild it anyway, you might as well correct the mistakes that you've made. A test framework or approach for validating the migration. I would say that if you've written end-to-end tests for your solution, you should be able to reuse those tests just by pointing at the new endpoint, because ultimately your solution should do the same thing. As far as unit tests goes, well, there are a lot of different platforms out there for writing unit tests, and NUnit, XUnit, SpecFlow. And a lot of these things can be executed from DevOps pipelines as well. So there's lots of different things out there. Would BTDF MSI work, or would you need the MS? Interesting. BTDF used. It's been a while since I've used that, and I'm just thinking it's. It needs the MSI that you would export from, but I don't think the MSI itself is different because you've used BTDF, is it? Like it probably, I guess it comes down to whether it reads that configuration that you have. At the moment, I just know it reads an MSI file. I don't know, I can't remember offhand what's different about the MSI that's produced from the BTDF framework. So I'd have to kind of get back to you about that one. Ritu. It currently only works with a BizTalk. Okay, so Dan's already answered the question. Thanks, Dan. Okay. Pretty hard to say. Okay. Which version does the migration tool work? That's a very good question. I don't know how far back it would go, because BizTalk has been producing MSIs for a long time. I would imagine it would go back, I would hope it would go back at least as far as BizTalk 2010. Because I remember that's before that maps were very different. I haven't tested it though myself, and I haven't seen anything officially written about that. If we have to run in-house, would you wait or start merge to a container environment now? It might be interesting stuff in the pipe. So definitely with Logic App Standard, you can see that that there's a lot of movement right now to get things to run everywhere. And we're going to see more and more developments in that, I'm sure, over the coming time. So if that is a requirement for you, I would probably wait, because right now the migrating tool doesn't support Logic App Standard yet. But that is on their pipe, that is on their roadmap. Dan, you answered a couple of questions. Great. Oh, great. Yep. Thanks, Dan. Dan's answering all the questions. Thanks so much. That's great. Right. In BizTalk, you have the ability to resume, but Dan's answered that one as well. Oh, I think he has. Resume suspended messages. Does the exported AI solution support that scenario? Well, I suspect this is where the checkpoint pattern actually helps you with that, because if it's possible to submit a message with the right checkpoint settings on it, it would skip the things that it's already done. I haven't tried it myself yet. What's your opinion on genuated logic apps? Well, I guess that's true. Anytime you have generated code, it may not necessarily be the most efficient code because it has to cater for a variety of scenarios. So it's going to probably generate more stuff than you would necessarily need. And that's probably something that as the team is looking at performance, they will probably need to consider with that. But remember that once these things are generated, you can go in and modify them and change them as well. At least it sort of gives you that framework and that groundwork to start with. In request response, can you point out what the potentially expensive integration account is needed for? So integration accounts are needed if you're using schemas or maps. Definitely, that's why we needed it in that solution. But remember, the tool is by default deploying a free integration account, which has some limitations on it. You can change that SKU if you want to, or if you already have a free one deployed in your subscription, you can change the scripts to use that existing free one. But yes, if you're going to do transformation, not needed for XML transformation, it's not needed anymore as standard SKU allows this without. I'm going to defer that question to the product team about that because I'm not sure about that. Yeah, it'd be great to see it work with BDDF. I agree, BDDF is something that's been used very, very widely in the community. Could you get, with multiple MSIs, I believe you will get multiple applications. That's what it will do. One thing to be careful about that is with shared .NET components in between them, you might get errors. So in that case, you might have to migrate each one separately, but they should produce separate applications if that's how you set up the MSIs. Oh, Ronnie answered the answer about Logic App Standard and the integration account. Thank you. Yes. Okay. A way to check the overall cost of the full migrated integration Azure. The only way I can think about to do the cost is to basically count the logic apps and try to estimate the traffic you're going to have through it. And then there's the pricing tool that you have in Azure. So there's no out of the box. There's no out of the box way I can calculate that easily for you right now. Right. What happened with the orchestration with long-running process? So that would be the logic app, would have broken that down into patterns, and the orchestrations would be implemented in logic apps. And orchestrations can be long running. They are stateful by default. One thing, if you want to improve the performance, is you can make them stateless if you're with logic apps standard. Once that's supported, you would have that option if you don't need the stateful aspects of it. But logic apps by default are stateful, so they can support long-running processes. Do XML transformation in general, any built-in support for XSL 2 or 3, or is this still 1.0? At the moment, if you migrate your BizTalk maps to an integration account, I suspect it's going to be using the same XSLT library to do it that BizTalk does. So if you wanted to have those more powerful features, you might want to implement it differently, like maybe in an Azure function, or maybe look at doing it with liquid templates, maybe. Okay. Good. Yeah, resubmitting using checkpoints. Thanks, Dan, for answering your question. With multiple MSIs, you'll get a single system application. Yes, well, the system application, yes, would be implemented once, but I expect, though, that with the, I might have misread the question before, but I thought he was talking about the custom applications. Each of those should actually be implemented, I think, with their own name, their own MSI file, and their own resource group. I think I've covered everything. I can see Dan has answered a lot of questions. Thanks so much, Dan. Great. Awesome. Are we still live? Are we still going? Or?
Yes, Dan, we are still live, and in fact, there are like more than 100 people listening to you now. They have not.
Oh wow. They haven't moved on yet. Okay, I'm just taking another look through the questions to make sure I haven't missed anything. Big shout out to Dan for answering so many of these questions. Got that one. Well, okay, so Joab says what we would like is some revisit or fresh look at Biz unit framework. Yep. Okay. So that's interesting because clearly on the roadmap, there's intention to have verify support in this tool when actually be able to create test cases and execute them. So it'll be interesting to see what they use, what framework they decide to go with on that one. Yep. Okay, the question from Jas. Again, looking for where it is. Oh yeah, that was the one about the generated logic apps. Yes. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. As Dan said, yeah, it gives you a starting point, and then from there you can then tweak it as you need to.
I think Dan, the maximum recording session is come to an end now. We have to stop here. Thanks for the session.
Okay, so for everybody who's still here, thanks so much for attending. Please reach out to me if you have any questions. If they're hard questions, I'll point you to Dan Probert because he's more of an expert on this tool than I am. So if you look him up, I'm sure he'd be happy to help as well. It's so helpful here as well. But if you want to connect with me, again, that QR code will bring you to my LinkedIn profile. And if you send me an invite to connect, just mention that you've been at this presentation.
cove.co.